we get started. I'm going to turn the Zoom screen over to Ann Scott, Executive Director of the Atheneum.
Thank you, Amy. Good evening. I'm Ann Scott, the head librarian at the Nantucket Atheneum. And on behalf of our board and our amazing staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the library's first installment of the 2021 Geschke Lecture Series. And I would like to take a moment to recognize the extraordinary impact that Chuck and Nan Geschke have had on the island and on the Atheneum. We were saddened to learn of Chuck's passing last week, and we send our deepest condolences to his family. The Geschke Lecture Series was established in 2005, and Chuck and Nan's leadership allowed the library to greatly expand the scope of its programming and has provided a solid foundation of excellence to the Atheneum's offerings ever since. Tonight's speaker embodies the best of what the lecture series offers, a program that informs and challenges audiences with current critical ideas and issues. Dr. George Friedman is an internationally recognized geopolitical forecaster and strategist on international affairs. He's the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures and author of 6 books, with his most recent being The Storm Before the Calm, published in 2020. Dr. Friedman has briefed numerous military and government organizations in the United States and overseas, and appears regularly as an expert on international affairs, foreign policy, and intelligence in major media. His most popular book, The Next 100 Years, is kept alive by the prescience of its predictions. Other best-selling books include Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, The Next Decade, America's Secret War, The Future of War, and The Intelligence Edge. His books have been translated into more than 20 languages. He received his bachelor's degree from City College of the City University of New York, and he holds a doctorate in government from Cornell University. Welcome, George Friedman.
It's good to be here. This is the first book I've written on my own country. All of my books previously have been about other countries. And it's very strange to use the method I use to depersonalize the United States, forget my place in it, forget my hopes for it, forget my animosities, forget everything, and try to understand how this country works, which is a presumptuous beginning, but it is what I was trying to do. I started to write this book in about 1975 in a bar in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where I was sitting with some friends bemoaning the catastrophic state the country was in. We'd seen, as relatively young people, the murder of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We'd seen the 82nd Airborne called in to put down snipers in Detroit. We saw cities all over the country burning in the wake of the killings. We saw a demonstration in Chicago that utterly disrupted the Democratic Convention and was a new mark of incivility that we can possibly imagine. We saw Kent State, the shooting that took place, and we saw an economic crisis triggered by the rise of oil prices that paralyzed the country. In addition to that, extraordinarily, for the first time in history, a president was forced out of office because of suspicion of criminality, which actually was true. So at that time, I said, what's happening? And I asked the question, has this ever happened before? And I noted a series of times, starting with Andrew Jackson and his presidency, when the nation turned away from settling the coast to settling the interior, and the eastern banks were making it impossible for them to buy land, settlers to buy land or equipment or anything else. And then I looked at Rutherford B. Hayes, came right after the Civil War, who both faced an upheaval economically because of the war and instituted the gold standard, which kicked off the Industrial Revolution in the United States. I then looked at Franklin Roosevelt, who oversaw, if you will, the transformation of the United States and the Depression, of course. And finally, in 75, I looked at this and I said, well, what's next? Having drunk a great deal that night, I went home and put the notes away and forgot about it. Then I came back to it in 2015, which is when I started writing the actual writing of the book. And I said, well, if this model of every 50 years roughly, a massive social upheaval takes place, economic upheaval takes place, incredible rancor, incredible political anger. John Quincy Adams accused of stealing the election. He did, but it was a clean steal. Watching Rutherford B. Hayes, who absolutely stole that election. Going through all of these periods, I said, well, we're 5 years away from the next crisis. In 2020, we should have a definitive crisis, if my theory was true. And I spent a lot of time studying it and tried to understand why what appeared to be an accidental sequence had a logic in it. And so this book was published in February 2020, February 25th, in fact, which was the day that the COVID crisis began shutting the country down. And let me assure you, do not publish a book on that date. That's a very bad time to publish a book. But published it was. And the book argued that we are in for a period, the next from 2020 to about 2023, 24, of enormous upheaval, enormous unrest, tremendous rancor, economic dislocation, and I didn't even count COVID because it wasn't there, okay? And that at the end of this century, a new era would emerge, just like the Westerning era emerged, just like the Industrial Revolution emerged, and so on. So the question really was, why 50 years? And the answer I have is not a good one. It's that, and I'll get into it a bit, technology turns it. And the question is, why does it cycle? And the answer, it begins with understanding that this is an invented country. Unlike Italy or Russia, which may have been invented but very long ago, which is what I'll call an organic country, we were invented. Our Constitution was formed by a committee. Our public is formed by immigrants, which we're not supposed to say anymore, immigrants who have come in and forged this country. There is no one in the United States who came here because he had such a great life back home, he wanted to try something bad. All of us descend from people who came here out of necessity, out of opportunity, out of something that we might get. It's also the geography is invented. The Erie Canal, the meaning of the Mississippi River, and how the Mississippi River changed its purpose as it began to drain the agricultural system of the central states, sell the goods to Europe, which is where they sold it, allowed Europe to take their farmers and move them into the cities to work in factories, and kicked off the global industrial revolution. I mean, these were mechanical things. The regime, the people, the countryside, all of these were things that were, how should I put it? Natural things that had an unnatural start. It isn't like other countries. And at the root of everything that we do is technology. The creation of our government was the creation of a machinery of government that was designed basically not to work very well because government was not trusted, private life was valued, and it was always feared that the politicians would screw things up. Okay, so we saw it as a machine that metabolized immigrants, a machine that produced and exported. It was a machine. When you are invented, that's the way you think about it. Okay. So in each era, there is some innovation, some invention that transforms the country and that runs its course. So, for example, without going through all of them, the period from Hayes to FDR, what it was invented was electricity. Well, electricity wasn't invented, but the utilization of electricity. Urbanization was necessary for factories because transportation was poor and factories had to ship goods back and forth. And electricity made it possible to work and live at night. Imagine a city without lights. Well, it couldn't be 9 million people living in them. That wouldn't be possible. And electricity, this core technology that was developed, also developed a range of things from movies to phonographs to more things than I can imagine. Electricity drove the economy and continues to drive it. And until the 1920s, electricity transformed the country. It was completely different. And then after that, it became routine. The massive transformations were done. There are many, many things to do with it. It was going to be necessary, but it was no longer an innovation. It became a commodity. We all understood electricity and so on. In the same sense, really in the Roosevelt period, the key commodity was the internal combustion engine, which allowed two things to happen: have cars, which changed the geography of the country again. The way we encountered the United States changed dramatically. But in addition to transforming that, made the airplane possible. The first aircraft flew on internal combustion engines. So it transformed the way we traveled. And that was critical. And really, you go forward and you see that it's inconceivable that General Motors, that Ford, that Chrysler would not be the dominant companies. In the same way, it was impossible to imagine that Edison's various companies wouldn't dominate. But what happened was that at a certain point, about 1965, 50 years after the first Ford plant was introduced, the cars became a commodity. And the creation of automobiles went from technologists to marketing people. I remember as a kid, the announcement of new cars, and this one will be in green with fins or whatever. The marketing people and the designers desperately trying to show some difference from what really is a commodity. And the net result was that the automobile, by the 1970s, the automobile companies were in deep trouble, each for different reasons, but Chrysler on the verge of bankruptcy. So what we see is that the institutions created by the free market ruthlessly attacks these corporations when they become commodities. You can't have a major commodity corporation that sells commodities, things that are just there. So the automobile is still there. It still matters. We still buy it, but it's not the symbol of our prosperity. Okay. It's not the symbol of who we are. It's just that. In 1971, I was at Cornell and I went into off-campus store and I held in my hand a Hewlett-Packard calculator. It was a very nice calculator. They wanted $225 for it. This is 1971, and me in graduate school. So we were parting companies. And I had no idea what was going to be found in there, what was inside there. What was inside there was a microchip. And the microchip created an entirely new technological culture, an entirely new way of living that we all have benefited from or certainly experienced, okay? And that technology is no longer cutting edge. It is 50 years old. From the time that I stood there up at Cornell in College Town looking at that calculator, well, we have reached a point where it no longer is sparkling, where Apple is desperately trying to create a market for a new cell phone, this time in black. I'm not kidding. They introduced it like that should matter. These companies are towering, Apple, Intel, all of these companies continue to tower over us as General Motors did over the economy, as all previous companies did. But the point is that productivity declined per person. The growth rate declined, I should say, in each of the past 4 years. Now, in the 1990s, they surged, they overwhelmed. That was in the 1990s. Now we are at a later date. And in the 1990s, they're doing pretty much what the automobile did or electricity did or any of the other things did. They are becoming commodities, okay? Try as they may, there are many new commodities being spun off, okay? But still, the transformative element, the thing that made us different, ended. Now, notice that these technologies tend to have 50-year cycles. Again, I look at it empirically. This is how the cycles they have, but there it is. And we're coming to the end of this cycle. And the end of the technological cycle always coincides with increasing social unrest and political tension. Reasonable, the economic opportunities become skewed. In the case of the last cycle that ended with the election of Ronald Reagan, the problem was there was not enough demand for goods, that goods were more expensive than they should be by the market, and the system didn't work. Our problem today is too much money in this cycle. The amount of money you could get for a simple savings account, they almost made you pay for the right to put it in the bank, which means that people who had saved money, that savings had no marginal value beyond what they could buy. The crisis is compounded by COVID because so much money was printed that whereas the economists will explain to you it won't have any effect, you can't put $3 trillion in the economy and not shake it up. But this was happening anyway, okay? So the monetary system we had reached its end. Interest rates had gone to nothing. Money was worth nothing. A different crisis than the previous period, but a crisis. The corporations that ran the microchip economy had become so vastly powerful that they were under massive political attack, very much like in Roosevelt's years and so on. And when we look at, when the society itself, not necessarily because of the microchip, but old issues, deep issues, like the relationship of Blacks to American society, emerged again, as they had in the 1960s and 70s, as they had in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan emerged again, and segregationists dominated. These are all as we say now politely, conversations. I love conversations. They scream at each other, and it's called a conversation. These were the transformative events. So race always reemerges, but also social tension. And one of the social tensions that we have in the Roosevelt era was the tension between the industrial working class and the others, including management, if you will. But now we have a different one. The industrial working class has declined. The great fortunes that created, General Motors and so on. I mean, they're not there, and unemployment and underemployment and drug use and everything has seeped into the center of the country. In the meantime, the technocracy has blossomed. The technocracy that accompanied the rise of the microchip has done wonders for itself and for the country. But as always happens, the division between the two sectors creates very different interests and very different perceptions of what the problem is. There are two dimensions to this. One of them is economic. One part of the country is experiencing an extraordinary boom. It now has moved here to Austin, Texas, where houses that you wouldn't buy for $12,000 are now going for $2 million. Okay, and they're being bought. And the people who used to live there in those houses are looking at them and what has happened to me? I didn't get to play. And there's a social aspect to it as well, in the sense of the crisis. One of the crises of the technocracy is the university. The university is the essence of the technocracy. It teaches the technocratic and other skills, as well as other matters. And who gets into these universities determines who they are. I remember, while I was writing the book, reading a interview form that people at Harvard used to interview candidates and then filled out, and they would be asked, is this a person you would like to room with? Is this a person that you would like to eat with, have dinner with? It was like reading The Great Gatsby, which is to say, what are the chances of a young woman from Arkansas who is opposed to abortion getting into Harvard? Well, it would be hard anyway, but it's not going to happen. You therefore have two educational systems. The community colleges and the state colleges are one system, very much rooted in the community, very much used in sharing communal activities. And then the better schools, as they say, championing the technocracy, having values that are similar, and teaching them. Well, this is the way it happened in each of the cycles. The universities became seismographs. And so you have a country where you're not going to get a internship to Goldman Sachs if you go to Arkansas State. Yeah, I mean, you might, but it's not the likely path. The great opportunities that are available, as in the Depression, are not available now to that class. There's another part of this, which is a cultural division. In much of this country, churches are fundamental institutions, and they have a high deal of respect. And these churches teach that homosexuality is bad, premarital sex is bad, and these other things. They may practice them, but everybody feels bad about it. Now, what really is important to understand is that we've undergone a social transformation in which what had been previously banned groups for this group became championed by the technocracy. And those who were appalled by that, okay, were considered by Hillary Clinton deplorables. Well, this is going to give you a social crisis. And that gave us the last president. It gave you the last president because he was the champion of one half of the country. Hillary Clinton was the champion of the other half of the country, and the country split. I live in Texas, in a county that is all Trump. You don't live in Hayes County and not vote Trump. About 25 miles up the road is Austin. A friend of mine spoke for Trump and was almost lynched. This is the level of anger that exists in our society. But the most important is that the two groups do not know each other. Those who are of the technocracy don't know people struggling in the heartland. And those in the heartland read about these people, but they don't know each other. It's very similar, if you think about it, to the Great Depression. Those who were smashed by the Depression, okay, and those who weren't, I mean, it tilted toward those who were smashed, which is why Roosevelt won, but those who had been devastated by the Civil War were facing those who had profited mightily over the Civil War. So this goes back all the time. We reach this point of a great division in our country. And in this great division, there is no neutral ground. Believe me, I get hammered every way you look, okay? When I talk about how Harvard selects people, I'm a fascist. And when I talk about the values in the churches, I'm a communist. And that's where we are. We are at that moment that happens in every cycle where we cannot believe that anyone who's reasonable would disagree with us. And those who do are monsters. Both sides, regard them as that. And then they start behaving as monsters because the war breaks out and they battle. So what we are seeing now is the first phase of this transformation. The second phase of this transformation comes now. Usually when you take a look at last phase, you had Nixon. Okay, he was replaced by Gerald Ford, a nice non-entity, and Jimmy Carter, who desperately tried applying Rooseveltian economics to a non-Rooseveltian phase. So you go into a period of relative quiet politically. Underneath it, tremendous tension, tremendous anger that goes on, until at the end of this period, you have a transformative president. Now, presidents are like diapers. They get changed every 4 years. They are not the instrument to transform society. Rather, they wrap themselves around the forces that are projecting them. Ronald Reagan did not know what he was going to do. The idea that he was going to cut taxes on the wealthy and hold them steady for the poor was insane, violated every law. But that created the investment capital that created the microchip economy. That's how people invested in the 1990s and made 10 baggers. No investment money, no society. So you had that sort of thing, that takes place. And in each society, when Roosevelt faced the Great Depression, he understood he had to increase consumption. And when he did that, he was accused of being a communist. Well, it still worked out. Okay. So now we're moving into a period where about 2028, give or take a week, about 2028, or sometime around there, a new president will come into office. Roosevelt had no idea what he was going to do. Walter Lippmann said of Roosevelt, he's the least qualified man ever to be elected president. That's it. Ronald Reagan was said to be an idiot, completely unqualified. But each of them presided over the transformation that has to take place. Well, the transformation that has to take place here is we have to replace the microchip industry as the center of growth. It's not high tech anymore. It's 50 years old. It's getting boring in a lot of ways, but they are really going to always be here. There's always going to be money to be made. There's always jobs there. What comes next? Well, economically, all uh, all technology is invented to serve a social need. Um, Edison was very frank about that. And we've now have a time when we've managed the question of radically transforming communication and making it more efficient while managing the transfer of information. We've changed the entire structure of these things. We're reaching the end of the transformative period. So what is the social problem we have to face? Well, the critical social problem we have to face is that we're all living longer and the millennials are having fewer children. Now, drawing a curve, that means you're going to wind up in a society with a lot of old people and fewer young people. That's a crisis. It's a crisis not only because I plan to be old and cranky and really enjoy myself. It's a crisis because if we maintain the diseases we have now, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, everything else, these people become massive consumers and not producers. And as you have a smaller working class supporting consumption-hungry people, you have a problem. Therefore, the next technology has to be medical. It has to be medical because that's the problem that's coming. It has to be solved. And we have to find a way to solve these diseases. Now, the way that science, medicine works now, they solve diseases one at a time. This guy's working on Alzheimer's, that guy's working on Parkinson's. There's no general theory. Now, at this point, I'll stop. My son is a biologist, a professor of biology, and he really resents my speaking on this subject even. I'll stop, but to say that I never imagined the microchip as a solution to things that I was doing at that time in the military. I never imagined many things. I'm not a technologist, but I do know it's needed. When that comes in, we're going to need a lot of money to invest in it because the new phase always begins with that. So suddenly, the problem we have becomes a potential benefit if money retains its value. So economically, money retaining its value is crucial. And so this is where we are, and this is where we're going to go to, and it's perfectly normal. And right now, it really is a miserable thing to be an American because we're living with the original sin of our republic, slavery. We're living with the deep division of the country in mutual hatred. And we're living with an economy that's slowly, dubiously churning to a close. Medicine, by the way, to rapidly solve things like COVID. So all these things come together into that problem. I want to go into just a little bit one other cycle that there is. That other cycle that we really have to think about is an institutional cycle that goes for 80 years. Every 80 years, it shifts. We were founded 80 years later. We redefined the relationship between the states and the federal government through a civil war. 80 years later, World War II was fought, and we redefined the relationship between the federal government and society. The federal government essentially nationalized the American economy, and it denationalized only to a limited sense. The problem, each of these occurred from wars, by the way, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. Each were necessary. You didn't have a choice. The war that I think defines us is the wars in the Middle East. 18 years of mismanagement, failure. And whether you're for it or against the war, it doesn't matter. It was not managed really well, what we were doing there. And that raises the fundamental question of our society, the government of expertise. So World War II was won by the experts. The experts built the Liberty ships, the experts built the landing craft, the experts built the bombers and nuclear atomic bombs and everything. And that notion that experts are needed to run the government became a foundation of our government, where we have experts working on all sorts of projects. The strength of an expert is he knows one thing very well. His weakness is he isn't really aware of other things, particularly the consequences of what he does. He also creates a government that's incomprehensible. Social Security, if I recall, was 15 pages long, the legislation that passed it. The implementation of the healthcare bill was 15,000 pages. That, from an expert point of view, is perfect, but who knows the whole thing? Who knows? So we are in a position where we've created a government that is stovepiped. And a lot of that can be seen in the COVID problem, right? This is the medical solution. What is the social solution? What is the political solution? How do we reconcile these things? So the government question now is, what is the relationship of our government to itself? Yeah, what is the relationship of a fundamental right in our Bill of Rights, which is the right to petition our government? That almost doesn't exist. Not because they want it not to exist, but how can I get to anyone who has the authority? So, I was eligible for Medicare. Said eligible. I decided not to take it. I have my own health care. It didn't matter. I find out that I'm going to be fined for not taking the health care. Not much, but really fined. So I go to a very nice person in the office who would love to help me, but can't, because the experts who wrote the regulations left no room for her decision-making. She could not make a decision. She was not permitted to. So the rules preclude petitioning the government, because I can't get to the Secretary of Health, Education, of Health, and so on. I can't get to these people. And only corporations have, lobbyists who can do that. So in the development of expertise, we also developed systems of management from which there is no appeal. And this is our fundamental problem there. And that also has happening for the first time in our history at the same time. The social and economic cycle and the institutional cycle are bottoming out three years apart. Now, when I say 3 years apart, I really have no idea how many years, but pretty close. And I don't know how deep the crisis goes, but this crisis of the federal government and the inability of people to trust it, which we saw in an insane form at the Capitol building, just not trusting the federal government, has to be addressed. And so we are in this crisis. We've been in it before. We will solve it. It will be ugly, and we'll call each other names. Other than that, stay home, watch TV, enjoy. And if there are any questions, let me turn to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. I'm sure we have questions, and looks like Amy's coming back on, and Janet.
Yeah, so put your questions in the Q&A. Oh, here's one. So Janet wants to know, how does the George Floyd court decision shape your thinking about our next cycle?
Well, it's what I would expect in the cycle. We're already in the cycle. In the same way that we saw Martin Luther King killed and violence in the cities in the 1960s and 70s, in the same sense, what's happened there is inherently part of this cycle. And racial tension is always part of the American cycle, along with other things. But yeah, that is simply a symptom of where we are.
I have a question. I really enjoyed the book, and I found it really accessible. And but as I was thinking, kind of what you said at the end, Dr. Friedman, is I felt a little bit like helpless, but also a little relaxed at the same time because it seems inevitable. And so I'm curious on what's the action, if there was an action society should be taking or the average person should be taking?
Well, most of you are under some pressure, whatever it is, social pressure, a economic pressure, something. So it's not a theoretical question. You will do what you need to do in order to achieve your goal, politically, what have you. 330 million other Americans are doing the same thing. So what you are seeing is a massive millions of people feeling the same sorts of pressures, some different, some the same, struggling with each other. And it's not that it's all determined, it's simply that, look, this is the point we're at in history. This is the problem. You're experiencing it. The decision you make is going to be paralleled by a lot of other people. You're not alone in making that decision. But this is a time of, unlike the 1990s, for example, a time where we all come under enormous pressure, economic, social, cultural, and so on. And we break into tribes, but in the end, the tribes have blended in back together. On a personal level, I drink a lot.
Okay, so Albert has a question. The wearing of masks for COVID seems to have become a battle line for the two sides. Is this just a temporary phenomenon, or is there something else going on here?
What is going on is a distrust of the federal government and experts. Fauci has become the symbol of the disease. The federal government is not trusted by vast numbers of the American public and deeply trusted by another care. Oddly enough, I find it interesting that the technocracy trusts the government more than the declining industrial class. So what you see here is you come down to Texas, go to Austin, nobody gets in anywhere without a mask. You come down here and go to that town, Bandera, that I went to recently, nobody gets in with a mask. And what it represents is our relationship to the federal government and trust of what it says. So, like in the 1970s, there was deep distrust of government that was lying to us about war and things like that. Okay, it's not new. Now the issue is masks. So the problem is that the experts, like Fauci, argue that we should do this, this, and this, but they're not aware of the social consequences of what they're saying. They shouldn't be. That's not their job. But we don't have intermediaries who are aware, who can supersede his advice or shape it or somehow or another. So we get very blank, you must do this, to a nation that is hostile to anybody telling it what to do. Remember, this is the United States. We were built on, what Davy Crockett said. I am going to Texas, and you may go to hell. That's the United States. And down here, you get a lot of that.
Okay. We have another question. Could you speak a little bit more to your prediction on how biotech, like the microchip, will drive the innovation in our current cycle?
Well, I'll call it medicine instead of biotech, which biotech immediately gives you a hint that this might be a microchip possibility. And I want to move beyond that, so I'll call it. Well, what I said before was, look, we are going to get a demographic shift. That's no longer in question. That is going to happen. And part of it is going to happen because medicine is extending life, but not making it productive. So I may live to be 90 and I'll be drooling for the last 10 years. And somebody's going to have to feed me. You're not going to kill me, I hope, but it's bad. So this is a social problem we have to deal with. It's not as an option. And the option falls to medicine because they deal with these things. And they're going to have to undergo a revolution. in the same way the computer industry underwent a revolution after the microchip. It used to be, UNIVAC and things like that. And the revolution they have to do is speed up the rate of innovation. They're used to the idea of an infinite amount of time to get the right answer, which is good. Except socially, when you become the key company, the key profession, you don't have that leisure. So there's a cultural shift that has to take place. It's going to be painful, but it doesn't really come to bear until, in the next 20 years before we really need that solution. But you can take a look at the demographic figures, take a look at the birth rate of the millennials, take a look at the extension of life expectancy, and you'll find it about the date where it's going to become a problem.
So Lenny asks, how does immigration play into all of this?
Everything the United States does is based on immigrants. All of our history. I personally was born in Hungary. I came here when I was a small child. I'm an immigrant. My wife, who's from Australia, is a daughter of the Mayflower, descendant from Bradford. They went over there, they came back here. Bradford was an immigrant. Okay? We are all immigrants. And as I said at the beginning, no one comes here who's doing well at home. You don't abandon your home if you're making billions, You come here because you busted out. Okay. And now we have, in every generation, we get immigrants. So the Scotch-Irish, Presbyterians, in other words, were loathed when they came here. They were seen as unruly, impossible, and cannot possibly exist in the United States. The Irish Catholics, were seen as the same. The Germans were seen as the same. We have a town here called Fredericksburg, which is heavily German, and as in flying German flags. And they came here in the 1840s. So there's nothing new about immigration, including the hatred of the immigrant. Every immigrant class was hated. Okay? So what we have now is Mexican immigration, which is different because it's on the border and they're always coming north. Okay? But one of the funny things about the Mexicans is when you call them people of color, they really hate that because they don't see themselves as that. They see themselves as conventional immigrants who, in a couple of generations, are going to be very wealthy. And they are, if you look at the Cubans or others. So this is a normal process. 1, you get immigrants. 2, you hate the immigrants. 3, you go to work for the immigrants. This is the American story. So the immigration situation we're facing now is no different than we've seen since the beginning of the Republic. And there's no way of arguing, saying that this is the same way as were, because everybody knows that we were wrong about the Presbyterians and certainly wrong about the Irish Catholics. But we can't say that we're wrong in the Mexicans. So this will go on. And the important thing to remember is that each side will pander to their own group. So again, if you see the split in the country, you will see the right wing afraid of the migrants. Used to be the left wing, early 20th century, was afraid of them. Whoever's poor is afraid of them. And you will see the technocrats, who may not have ever seen a Mexican, vastly in favor of their rights. It's a wonderful game to watch. If there's no football on, watch the American argument on immigration.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Hans.
Well, you speak to the end of these cycles, like these cycles of innovation, and how it sounds like they correlate with an increase in social unrest. And so, as you talk about the next phase of innovation and what that might look like, I just wonder then how does that change the direction that we're going in terms of these divisions, these social divisions?
Well, let's take a look at Roosevelt era. Divided between the industrial working class and big business and a lot of other groups, okay? Industrial working class are ethnic, Catholic, and Jewish. The others are Protestants, okay? What happens is that you evolve the immigrant groups that make this up into something new. So underlying everything is the fact that a lot of these people, one of the things is Americans get bored. We got bored with the Vietnam War and with anti-war demonstrations. So as these go on, people get bored and start to innovate and find solutions. So as we move into this period and the biological industry, the medicine industry starts employing vast numbers of people, all of whom went to some obscure university, okay, you see a transformation, mediation. So go through the first. We are at the end of the last cycle. All hell is breaking loose. A new solution will come out. It'll take about 10 years. It took about 10 years for Reagan's solutions to take hold. And then we go into a period of a golden age where we look back on the 50s as a golden age. And we look back on the 90s as really stunning, and the 20s, okay? So there's always a golden age. And then it turns into live in hell. That's America.
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Friedman.
I was going to say that other countries don't have this cycling. They weren't built like us with everything temporary, with the expectation that nothing would be permanent. It wasn't built with various ethnic groups and with different histories at war with each other. And it wasn't built on technology. Okay? The United States is. And all those things make it work this way. So as I said at the beginning, I usually work on other countries. I worked on this one on my own, and I was very surprised by what I found, which is that it has a very crisp logic, and it needs this period to clean out the system. I'm sorry.
We have a question. We've had some social justice progress in the last 50 years, and they're thinking especially of gay marriage and the recognition that love is love. This population also has economic might. How do you see this contributing to this cycle?
Well, there's huge resentment against the idea that gay marriage is marriage. Again, they don't see this as social progress, social justice. They see it as two things: a deterioration of moral values and an attempt to delegitimize their own religions. So it's a problem that comes on in both ways. The class that embraces the new ideology normally is the wealthy class. They're a novel class. They try to invent new things. They embrace them. The declining class is usually conservative because it's under pressure and it clings to its values. So naturally, you're going to have a situation where tech, the Google people, all embrace this transformation of our understanding of sexuality. And naturally, you're going to have, again, in Arkansas, I don't know why I'm picking on Arkansas. In Arkansas, you're going to have a feeling that this is a direct violation of the rules, laws of God, but even more, an attempt to destroy their church. So we will fight. And what comes out of it usually is an unexpected social change, because what came out of, for example, the Roosevelt years, was Reagan. And a Reagan who was very different from what we expect a conservative Republican to be in 1930. A very different set of values, very different persona. So we get these new personas that fit. Remember, I was talking about when that you will do what pressure forces you to do. Okay, same with presidents. Okay, I doubt very much that Biden has the slightest idea what he's going to do next, but it's going to be what works as president, and that's going to define him. And Reagan certainly had no idea what he was about to do until reality told it to him. The great presidents are those who have few opinions of their own and listen very carefully to reality.
That sounds very quotable. So our next question is from Brooke, who asked, do you think the concentration of wealth is necessary to fund the necessary investment in transformations in medicine?
Well, if you're poor, you probably don't have a lot of money to put into a startup. So if you're going to start a new technology, it costs a lot of money. Go back and see what it took to begin many of these companies. They normally, in other countries, governments do this. And governments are not very good at this, as they wouldn't be good here. Therefore, there has to be people with surplus capital of significant amounts. And that's called the rich. And many of them lose their shirts on various investments because they're not nearly as bright as they thought they were, and some make fortunes. But if there is no rule, if there is no capital available to buy the equipment, hire the people, and everything that a startup needs, okay, then there won't be one. The United States has a large number of rich people. What had happened was they had lost investment capital during the later years of the last period. Reagan gave back to them. Now we're going to have increased taxes, no question about it, which is we have to increase consumption as well. But there's plenty of reserve capital among the wealthy to build the next cycle. But I can't even imagine the kind of dinguses they're going to have in order to make this. I asked my son, he does mitochondrial research, which I don't fully understand, but he said he needed a machine. The machine cost $4 million. I almost had a heart attack. He says, by the time this is done, you have no idea what this will cost. And he has no idea if it'll work. That's the tech revolution.
We have a question. It's from Anonymous, and I know what you say in your book, so this will be interesting. What weight do you give climate change when evaluating the next technological challenge?
I don't know. Look, climate change has become a religion. Down here in Texas, there ain't no such thing. Well, we're oil country. Up north, we're going to die in 3 years. The fact is, I started my career as a military modeler. I modeled wars, mathematical modeling. I know a little bit about it, but I don't really know enough about climate. There are so many variables in climate. Just the process of saying, what is the world's temperature? How do you take the world's temperature? How do you track all those variables? I'm not denying at all that climate change is there or is catastrophic. I'm just saying, I don't know, because when I look at the models that are presented, they don't use a math that would be recognized in many cases. So there are a lot of people out there on both sides who are charlatans. And the problem is, this is a very complicated issue, and I'm always reminded of the population boom. Because when I was in the 60s, we were told we were going to run out of food by 1970 by the Club of Rome, which was at that time like the Brookings Institute. So it didn't happen. It didn't happen because they didn't take into account a bunch of variables, such as people having fewer kids in urban society. Okay, so birth rates had to decline, and so it didn't happen. All right. Here we have a question. Could that have happened? Yes, but there were variables that no one knew of that intervened and changed it. Could those variables be there? Yes. It could also be variables that make it so much worse that I can't go outside. I don't know, is the answer. And frankly, I don't trust anybody who says he does, but that's because I'm cranky and old.
Okay, let's see. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So here's one from Mark, who asked, what implications does this cycle have in reshaping our identity as a nation in relation to the rest of the world? We've gone through 4 years of abandoning NATO, shifting our view about who is our quote unquote enemy from Russia to China, et cetera, et cetera. What's next?
Well, let me intervene and say we did not betray NATO. NATO betrayed us. There's an obligation by every NATO member to devote 0.2% of its GDP to military. No, except for 2 nations in NATO, has that been carried out. NATO is a military alliance. You cannot have a military alliance without a military. And a country like Germany doesn't have one. So what is the point of a military alliance if they can't defend themselves? They like us being there. Okay. So the answer is we had an alliance and it had a purpose when the Soviet Union was there. When the Soviet Union collapsed, its purpose declined. Everybody said, let's pretend the Russians are still there and have an alliance. The Europeans were very smart. They said, okay, we absolutely have an alliance. We will have dinners, we'll have toasts, but we're not putting in the money we promised we put in. So my view, and I'm passionate on this because I spend a lot of time in Europe and I hear this stuff, okay? My view is, look, there's obligations to be met that the Europeans haven't met. As to the shape of the United States, let me describe it this way. The United States is the only country with major ports on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Because it has those ports, it is defended from invasion, plus the fact that Mexico and Canada can't invade us, even if they wanted to. Virtually every other country in the world is subject to invasion. We're not. The natural condition of the United States, therefore, is isolation, not engagement. Isolation because we don't have risks that other nations run, and we can withdraw. Now, we also want to make sure there is no naval power. We stole the Atlantic from the British in World War II. And yeah, the Lend-Lease said, we'll lend money, we'll lend you 40 destroyers, and you'll give us all your bases in the North Atlantic, basically. So that was the end of the British Empire. And we beat the Japanese out of it. Now, the one thing we want to make certain of is that no power can take over the Atlantic or the Pacific, and that's where the Chinese are threatening to do, but they're far away from that. So the United States has a consistent foreign policy to remain isolated as long as possible, build alliances to block the other. So our alliance in the Pacific is Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, Singapore. In other words, it's an alliance that's bigger than NATO by most measures. And why? Because now the issue is China. Russia is far less of an issue. And the United States shifting its balance about is the same as every country would in the same position. So I wouldn't argue on that level that the United States has abandoned or changed anything. The Russians have collapsed. NATO is gone. We can rebuild it if you want, but everybody has to ante up.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This is from Kenneth. In essence, it seems we continue fighting civil wars on race, on the role of government, on the relative values of cities versus the heartland, and so forth. Can we do this without a fight, large-scale violence, or not?
Well, except for the Civil War, which was large-scale violence, we have. And there's not always the same issues. I mean, different classes are engaging in the same discussion. There's a declining class that behaves very much as the declining class we see now. There's a technocracy, which behaves very much as there's a rising class, which behaves very much like our technocracy. But it becomes a declining class after a while, and it goes on. So we will certainly have a degree of violence. America's a violent country. It's from its founding was a violent country. And growing up in the Bronx, it was certainly a violent country. But that's our character. And one of the odd things about the United States, as opposed to the French, for example, is many of us loathe our character. This is who we are. The French love themselves. I wish we'd be more like that, but that would require that we embrace things that are really hard to embrace. As it is, the United States is not a lovable country.
Okay, on that note, unless there's a final comment, thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. I really did enjoy the book. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Amy, and thank you everyone for coming. We have a number in this Geschke, number of speakers coming up in the Geschke series, so stay tuned, and thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.